Hello and welcome to Cognitations, a podcast in which we interview cognitive scientists about their work and how it applies to our everyday lives. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the mind. It encompasses domains such as cognitive psychology, the neurosciences, computer science, linguistics, philosophy, and more. Let's jump into today's episode. Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of Cognitations. With today's hosts, I'm Jay.
And I'm Tanai.
Contemporary life is replete with problems. A very salient example is depression, which, according to the World Health Organization, affected 5% of the global population in 2019. That is 280 million people, a very large number indeed. Another problem is poverty and inequality. According to the World Bank, around 700 million people live in extreme poverty, an even larger number. Why are these problems on the rise? Are there features of contemporary societies that are exacerbating these problems? Moreover, how do they, so these problems, namely rising inequality and depression, interact? How can an evolutionary and or behavioral ecology perspective add novel insights to rethinking the source of these problems? Can such insights lead to effective social policies and change? Today's guest is here to answer these questions.
Or at least some of them. He's Daniel Nettle, a behavioral scientist at the Institut Jean-Nico. He's trained both as a psychologist and an anthropologist. He's made a large amount of important contributions, spanning across many topics in diverse disciplines like biology, psychology, and anthropology. For example, he has worked on psycholinguistics, the demise of languages, the consequences of smoking, depression, anxiety, epistemological aspects of evolutionary psychology, personality, and the list goes on. He's the author of 9 academic books, including Personality, What Makes You the Way You Are, and Happiness, The Science Behind Your Smile. Thanks so much for accepting our invitation and being on the show.
You're welcome.
So, just to get us started for our listeners, could you briefly describe your academic journey till now and how you got interested in cognitive science?
Well, cognitive science is an interdisciplinary endeavor, and so a lot of people end up here because they've come in a strange way, one way or another. I studied psychology originally as a student, and particularly I was interested in the psychology of language. And then I got a chance to go off and study the evolution of language with an anthropologist called Robin Dunbar, who had an opening for someone to work on that topic and left me a lot of latitude. So I did field work in Nigeria. I did agent-based modeling of languages. I did a very diverse portfolio of things, and I think I got a taste for the interdisciplinary. So that was really the first part of my journey. There are rather few jobs in anthropology, so most of my career I've worked in psychology departments because that's where the demand is. And of course, because psychological topics are very fascinating and very important. Often you feel you can address people's everyday concerns much more with psychological research than anthropological research. Though even though I do psychology and cognitive science, I always have a view to the broader perspective. How has this thing been in other types of human societies? Is it different across cultures? Is it different in different kinds of environments and at different historical periods? So I've always had that broader lens of anthropology.
Mm. So you were just thrown into field work.
I was thrown into field work, and in fact, the only thing I had was a picture of one of my PhD supervisor's husband who had done field work in that same village 25 years earlier, 30 years earlier, 25 maybe. So I turned up with this picture with very little command of the local language, kind of brandishing it. And they thought, European guy, 25 years later, this must be Richard's son. So they said, your dad was so amazing, come in. And then, I was thick as thieves with everyone after that. But firstly, he wasn't my dad. And secondly, I just couldn't really live up to Richard, who had been, a bundle of energy and had farmed the village and had done all kinds of stuff that, I couldn't really quite compete with. But anyway.
It's a good thing you got along with them because...
Well, yeah.
Otherwise you would have...
I think he was much loved, actually, and much much missed. And people thought, this is going to be a chip off the old block, but I think I was a disappointment by comparison. Yeah.
So since we were talking about fieldwork, and fieldwork is usually an important component of anthropology, and namely subdisciplines of anthropology, namely behavioral ecology and human behavioral ecology, maybe to just get some conceptual tools for our listeners. What is behavioral ecology?
So first, I wouldn't describe behavioral ecology as a sub-branch of anthropology. Quite the contrary. The origins of behavioral ecology are in the study of animal behavior and animal ecology. And it's just basically the idea that to understand the behavior of an animal, you have to understand it in its ecological context. So if an animal is doing something, why is it doing that? Why is it doing it in that particular place at that different time? And underlying that is the notion of the animal as a purposive individual that's trying to stay alive and reproduce. So it's an evolutionary perspective. It's trying to, we assume animals are trying to maximize some goal relative to their survival and reproduction. So really the classic studies were things like time use by animals. Where do they go? When do they forage? When do they sleep? When do they hunt? When do they socialize? Trying to understand how the structure of their environment might lead them to behave in certain ways rather than others. So then the application of it to humans came much, much later.
I see.
And yeah.
So how does this differ from what people call evolutionary psychology?
I don't think it differs terribly much. I think that it differs in its methods, in that whereas an evolutionary psychology approach would tend to take a phenomenon or a mechanism into the laboratory and say, well, you know, how can we manipulate this pattern of thought or feeling? Behavioral ecology would look at people in their everyday environments, their natural environments, and say, well, how are they using their time? What are they doing? You know, how are they interacting with one another? How are they making their livings? I think the two approaches are complementary. One is really looking at the behavior in its context, and behavior only makes sense in context. And the other is looking at the sort of the thoughts and feelings, the psychology, if you like, that underlies that behavior. So the two are very complementary, even if the methods are a bit different.
Right. And earlier you mentioned that behavioral ecology is not a sub-branch of anthropology because it's originated from animal behavior. And then you said it was only later that they applied it to humans. Why did it take us so long to apply it to humans?
Well, that's a very good question. And perhaps that reflects that in the 1970s, really, when behavioral ecology was being developed, and the 1980s, the social sciences had gone a long way from biology. And it was considered quite dubious to compare the motivations of people to those of animals, right? And to say it's reductive to think that people are only interested in survival and reproduction, and the goals they're trying to achieve are these kind of Darwinian ones of survival and reproduction. We've come to think of people as cultural animals that have all kinds of purposes and meanings that they entertain. So I think there had come to be a kind of qualm about interpreting people's behaviors in such instrumental terms, you know, trying to satisfy basic goals. People wanted to give more kind of cultural and meaning-based accounts of those behaviors. So in the early years of human behavioral ecology, that's the application of behavioral ecology to humans, they got a bad press in anthropology. People didn't like it.
I see.
Because they felt it was very reductive. It was initially... The reasoning was initially applied to people in the global south, and you know, people said, "What are you saying about these people? That they're animals?" You know, well, what's the? And of course, they are animals, right? But we all are. I mean, that's not, you know, people everywhere are animals, so it's actually not a stupid thing to compare people to animals. But there was a sort of, you know, there was a big gulf sometimes between the social sciences and the biological ones.
But wait, so people were assuming that the idea was that the actual motivations according to these studies could be expressed as, I want to survive, I want to reproduce.
Well, that's a good question. I think that that doesn't really quite work, not least because, for example, in contemporary societies, many people don't have children, and they certainly have many fewer than they could. So obviously people are not going around, you know, programmed to reproduce to the maximum. That's obviously not right. But I think particularly early human behavior ecology was actually kind of agnostic about that. It said people behave as if they were trying to maximize their reproductive success. It didn't really have an account of what they were actually thinking when they did that.
I guess the idea is is like that approach would be so absurd as to like that can't be the approach if you're.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think the really simple version of the approach, which is we're just trying to maximize our number of offspring or something, is obviously absurd. But I think something not very far from that is not absurd at all, which is that people care about their families. Bonding and reproducing are important goals for many people, not their only goals, but very important goals. People care about their survival. They care about the survival of their kin. I mean, I don't think these things are absurd, right? Of course, they surface in slightly different ways in different environments, and you're right. You can't just sort of you can't just predict what people will do based on what's going to maximize the number of their grandchildren, but I don't think it's actually an unreasonable account of what human life is about. That we have some pretty important goals like making a family, being part of our community, protecting ourselves, surviving, getting something to eat. These are actually pretty important goals. If you think the alternative possibility that human goals are completely undetermined by biology and people can make up any set of goals they like, that seems too far the other way, right? So I think human behavioral ecology is in a reasonable middle ground that says people have a variety of goals that are important to them, and obviously they're sometimes in conflict, and broadly speaking they're biologically comprehensible. They're things like being safe, being warm, having food, being connected to others of your species, pair bonding, having a family, etc. So I don't think that's unreasonable.
So it seems like there's a huge scope for behavioral ecology to be misunderstood in folk circles. So maybe here you could tell us about one of the fundamental assumptions of behavioral ecology, that is the phenotypic gambit.
Yes.
And what are some common misconceptions about this assumption?
Right. So when you say human behavioral ecology is an evolutionary approach, people immediately think, oh, that means our behaviors are determined by our genes, right? And that's not what it means at all. This is where the idea of the so-called phenotypic gambit comes in. And basically the way I explain this is the following, that imagine our genes had made us follow completely predetermined behavioral programs. We'd die out in a generation, right? Because, in fact, genes can't know what the detail of your environment is going to be in advance, right? They can't give you rigid programs that are going to work, in a cold winter and in a warm summer, right? They've got to give you some flexibility, right? So what evolution has actually provided us with is some general goals, I think, but an enormous amount of latitude to interpret and instantiate those goals in learned ways, because obviously the environment varies far too much for genes, as it were, to predict what it would be. So they've given us this flexible phenotype, and they've done that. I mean, that's why they've given us minds.
So what would be a phenotype?
Well, so for example, what you eat. Okay, so humans we know can be almost exclusively carnivorous. They can be exclusively vegetarian. They can eat tubers. They can eat grasses. They can eat animals. They can eat fish. Imagine a genetic program that says you will only eat bamboo, right? I mean, how is that going to be adaptive? It's a disaster. I mean, it's a disaster for pandas. That's why they're so rare. But it's like if evolution instead provides a quite flexible cognitive toolkit that says, find out what's in your environment, learn about it, find good ways of processing it, talk to each other about it, and so on. You end up with an animal and a creature that's just going to do better in a much wider variety of circumstances. And that's why humans have been able to sort of spread across the globe. So the phenotypic gambit is the idea that when you look at a behavior, let's say, people eating manioc in a particular part of the world, you can directly ask the question, why would manioc be a good thing to eat in terms of survival in this environment, without having to make any assumptions that there is a gene for liking manioc, right? You just assume that natural selection gave us minds. Minds are pretty smart. Minds have the right general goals and a very powerful ability to learn, and therefore you can directly say what people are doing with this manioc is probably adaptive, without kind of trying to say, oh, that's because I've shown that there was a gene for this particular thing that was selected for at this particular time. You can kind of black box a lot of the mechanisms.
But then, so hearing this, people could wonder, how is this assumption explanatory? Because if you do postulate that the phenotype is adaptable, then you could say, well, is it really explaining anything to say that it's evolution that's giving the organism this phenotype? Isn't it other things that would explain their behavior then? So I guess maybe an example of the kind of explanatory work this might help.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And my answer to that would be, it isn't particularly evolution. It's just the fact that we're evolved creatures is a useful way of starting to frame hypotheses about why people are doing things. So it's nothing more than that, right? It's not saying, evolution explains everything we do in a direct way. Clearly it doesn't. It doesn't explain, why I get the number 21 bus to work, for example. Except that, work is a thing that's meaningful to me. I want to get there in the most efficient way possible. It explains some very general principles. And then the 21 bus thing, you have to know.
So would that be an example of how you can frame a hypothesis in these terms?
Yeah. So let's imagine you think people are complete blank slates. Let's to take an example because it's come up. Let's look at how people get to work. You might say, well, I've no idea what motivates people. Maybe they take the longest route possible. Maybe they really like spending money on going to work. Maybe they're completely indifferent to how long it takes, or they don't seek out the best route. And you think, well, that doesn't explain anything, right? In fact, we know people are very sensitive to the cost, the effort, the perceived reputational consequences of driving a big diesel car versus a bicycle, these days, and so on. So there's a whole load of things that people do that make sense of their behavior that just limit the possibility space enormously. Now, you could say, well, isn't that just assuming people are rational? Yeah, it is assuming that, but it also says what they're rational about, what kind of things they value, right? So they, for example, they prefer to have adequate food to eat than to not have it. They prefer to not waste their time than to waste it. They, certain things that you can just cut down the possibility space of hypotheses, but it's only a starting point, right? It's not, people often say, oh, evolutionary explanations are a kind of just so story. You look at something, you go, that's because it's adaptive. And I think that's completely wrong. We look at something and go, I've no idea why that happens. Let's use some general evolutionary thinking to begin to narrow down the possibility space, but it's by no means the end of the story.
Right. So we talked about a very concrete everyday example, but if we were to go in the history of ideas, let's say in psychology and behavioral science, what would be one example of a behavior that was typically studied by, let's say, social psychology without adopting phenotypic gambit assumptions, that we fundamentally miss something insightful about that behavior, where behavioral ecology just came in and was like, hey, look, like this is the more appropriate way to think about it.
Interesting. I'm going to have to rack my brains for things about that. So often I think, just to sort of pedal back slightly, often I think it's not that the existing explanations were wrong, but rather that they were incomplete. Okay, so this is a sketchy example I'm just forming in my mind right now, but we've known for a long time that people in different societies have different concepts of what family is, what family relatedness is. For example, is it just your nuclear family, or is it a much broader sense? And are certain categories of people included? Now, I think social psychologists would tell you that whatever the concept of family is in that culture, people feel they have certain kinds of special moral obligations towards people they define as family that maybe they wouldn't have to non-family. Fine, they're not wrong about that. But in a sense, you say, well, why would that be? Right? And then when you think, well, yes, but family, these are people who, share your genes to some extent, and share, your genetic interests are in a sense tied up with these people, you start to think, oh, okay, well, that gives us a deeper handle on why people would have these special kinds of relationships that they perceive themselves to have particular obligations to. And then also look at the variation, right? So, why in some societies are families defined very broadly, like, you have many hundreds of relatives, and others it's more nuclear. And a lot of that seems to depend how resources and parenting are actually done in that society, right, in that ecology. So do you rely on a broad network of people who share resources, or is all the parenting done by a couple who move away from the parents of both of the the parents of both of the adults to a new place and form an autonomous economic unit? So the sort of psychology, who's in my family and what do I owe them, goes along with the resource, the way that resources are used in that society to continue family life.
Right.
See what I mean?
Right. So if I follow this correctly, is the idea that you're trying to sort of observe the breadth of flexibility around a particular genetic program that might be constraining behavior. So then would it be appropriate to sort of characterize human behavioral ecology as a universalistic paradigm for human behavior, just like cognitive science tries to?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So I think so. I wonder if others would disagree. So I think it's a strongly universalistic paradigm about the underlying goals.
I see.
And highly contextual about their realization. So I think any theory of human behavior has got to do this twofold thing, right? One is I think there is something called human nature, if you like, or what it is to be human. I think we're all striving for that actually, really, in our different ways. But on the other hand, you've got to admit that what people do is really, really different from place to place, and even amongst social groups in the same place. So you got to kind of do this straddling act where you say, how could a universal human nature produce such variable realization?
Right.
So, and I think you need a universalistic paradigm, as you say, that nonetheless allows or models the fact that humans respond to their context. And I think this idea of phenotypic flexibility does that. It says, there's some general goals, there's some general tendencies and priorities, but mainly, people are active decision makers who can kind of read their ecology and say, I'm not going to be able to fulfill this goal this way in this environment, so I've got to put my energy into a different way. So I think it does both the universality and the flexibility.
Right.
Which, by the way, just if I could add, it's very like a lot of theories in cognitive science, which says there's a sort of universal architecture, but maybe with some priors, but then experience fills in a lot of the detailed contents of the mind.
Yeah. So something that's quite intuitive, I think, for most people, is that our environments have an effect on our lives, and it shapes us in a way. So it wouldn't be surprising to hear that growing up in a resource-scarce environment would have some effect on your morphology or just your mental life, what you're disposed to think and such. And this jives quite well with a theory in human behavioral ecology, which is called life history theory. So what is this, and what are some misconceptions about it?
Don't get me started. So I don't like the term life history theory.
Okay.
Because I think it's become ambiguous. It's not really clear what people are talking about when they say it, but others might disagree. So I really see the fundamentals of behavioral ecology as being about energy allocation, right? How do I spend my energy? There's only so much I can do in the day. There's only so much energy I've got. So do I spend that on,
recording a
podcast, going out and meeting new people, learning a new skill, exercising the skill I've already got, looking after my kids, having more kids. I mean, all sorts of things, right? I might do. So I prefer to call this energy allocation theory, because that really, theory, it's not really a theory, right? It's just a principle. But I think that's just a very general way of thinking, that there are trade-offs. You've got to do something rather than another. And here we come to your example about poverty. which is if resources are scarce, I might conclude that it's better to kind of seize the moment, or and therefore be impulsive. Or maybe I make the opposite conclusion and say, this is just really hostile. I've just got to keep my head down and spend as little energy as possible because it's, too dangerous to do anything else, compared to someone who'd been brought up in abundance who might end up with quite different attitudes. And I think that's really, that's just given different opportunities and constraints, it's logical we'd kind of allocate our priorities in different ways.
So maybe I think we could seek some more clarification here, because I know you don't like the term life history theory, but the way I've understood life history theory as presented in behavioral ecology or human behavioral ecology is that it's a principle fundamentally about morphological traits or traits that influence reproduction. But then it also seems like people are applying this to psychological traits. Right. And saying things like, if we go with the example of poverty, that people are either psychopathic or are trying to maximize reward seeking just because, they were born in such a resource deplete environment. And this seems quite intuitive as an idea as well. Do you think this is the right way to think about psychological traits as well?
Well, that's why I resisted the term life history theory. I think it's best to reserve that for the morphological traits. And then I use the term energy allocation for the more psychological ones, just for various reasons that, to do with the history of the discipline, really. But I think that the intuition is right, that the psychological traits you develop will depend on the opportunities and resources in your environment, and that you might have very different priorities. If you were brought up in uncertainty compared to security, you might have different priorities and different behaviors, different ways of thinking about your future. That I completely agree with. I think it's misleading to call that life history theory, but the insight is the right one. Also, I think that psychologists tend to be overly fascinated with the idea that what happens to you very early in childhood kind of permanently sets these attitudes. I'm actually sort of more impressed by the fact that even as adults we can change quite a lot, right? If there were scarcity in Paris tomorrow, people would change their behavior, right? They wouldn't be like, oh, well, my childhood was fine, so I'll continue to behave the way I am. Their behavior would change, right? So let's not get too fascinated. Psychology is always fascinated with the idea that early childhood is tremendously important and so on. But I think that the adult environment is pretty important too.
Right, but I think this is interesting that you bring this up, because it seems like this energy allocation principle insight was already present in developmental psychology early on.
Absolutely. Didn't developmental psychologists already know this? Sure, fine, if they did. I'm not trying to say this is rocket science, but it's just actually... Yeah. It's useful to have general languages for talking about these things, and if the same idea comes up,
right,
from multiple sources, then
I just brought that up, assuming that there might be some new insight that this naming a new thing might have brought along with it. Has it?
I think it has. I think one of the ways that I think this approach is beneficial is that a lot of classical developmental psychology, I think, was quite deficit-based, right? If resources or experience are deficient, then you can't do something as an adult.
I see.
It's like, if there isn't enough money in the bank, you can't buy the thing. Whereas I think the adaptive perspective shifts that to say, well, it's more that as an adult, you actually decide to do something different because it makes more sense given the ecology that you've experienced, right? So that means that certain kinds of behaviors, for example, impulsivity, impatience is a good example. Rather than being like a deficit, your frontal lobes haven't developed, and so you're impulsive. It might actually be a decision, right? It's better to be focused on the present, given the experience of uncertainty that I've had.
So you're sort of bringing back rationality to what was earlier considered a deficit
Right, exactly so.
based agent. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, since we are talking about context and how context determines a lot of behaviors, let's talk about some very big contemporary societal changes that have happened in especially Western societies. So we are talking about poverty and inequality earlier as examples. What exactly do we know about the ways in which poverty and inequality affect our psychology and various decision-making capacities?
Right. So, I mean, one thing that's clear is that the experience of scarcity, and even in rich societies like Europe today, there's a lot of people who experience scarcity because although incomes are high, is also very expensive to live, right? So people don't necessarily have abundance just because the average income is higher than it was 100 years ago. The experience of scarcity causes people to focus much more on the short term. And this can look like just irrationality, they just make bad decisions. But actually, I think you can argue that it's quite adaptive, right? If the future is, first of all, if there's things you can do today that give you a big payoff in terms of your well-being or some goal you have, then of course you should prioritize. It's quite normal that you would prioritize those, right? And only once those basic needs have been satisfied would you sort of have spare for thinking about the long future. And the other thing is, if you face scarcity and poverty, the long future may never come about, right? Because you may die, but more than that, your social network may be disrupted, the place you live may be lost, all kinds of bad things can befall you. So it becomes perfectly adaptively sensible to actually focus on, what are the benefits I can get in the shorter term. So much so that many of the behaviors that are statistically associated with poverty, they look from a middle class perspective like just sort of bad decisions. But I think another very reasonable perspective is, well, if you were facing scarcity, you would think like that too, right? If you didn't know where your next month's rent was coming from, or whether you'd be even in this city next year, of course you wouldn't really be thinking about saving for your retirement. It wouldn't be on your list of priorities. So it just sort of reminds us that things that look kind of bad decisions in one context can actually be perfectly sensible ones if you understand the context they're actually being made in.
And so I guess some older models that don't really see things this way, what are called deficit models.
Right.
And you touched on something similar in your response to the question about developmental psychology.
That's right.
So what are deficit models? How do they work? And
well, deficit models are just the idea that somehow certain problems arise because people's minds or decision making are deficient in some way, right? If they're not bright enough to solve the problem, or they get distracted, or they don't know how to do it. There's something that they don't have that if they had it, they could make a better decision. And of course, deficits are real, right? If you grow up malnourished, you have worse health, and that's because there was a deficit of resources when you were a kid. So, of course, deficits exist. But I think we're sometimes too quick to assume that behaviors represent deficit when actually there are alternative possibilities. I think my favorite example is I worked for a long time on early childbearing. So in European countries, there's a very large difference in the age at first childbearing between people in poverty and people in affluence, like a decade. It's a long time. And a lot of the sort of discourse around this says, well, people in poverty are just making bad decisions. They're having,
Right.
they're having kids when they're young and they don't have resources, and why would they do that? But actually, of course, the babies of middle class people do better on all kinds of health outcomes than the babies of people in poverty. There's no surprise about that. But that's not because the people in the middle class people are having their babies later. It's because they're middle class, right? that's what it's about. It's because they have more resources. And if you do the relevant comparison, which is, do the babies of women in poverty who have their first baby at 17 do worse than the babies of women in poverty who have their first baby at 30? The answer is no. In fact, it's the other way around, because at 17 you're healthier, you're more fertile. You probably haven't had time to develop certain health problems you will develop later. Your mum is likely to be around to provide grandparenting, which might not be true 15 years later. So when you actually think in an environment where resources are scarce, health declines rapidly with age, and the kind of careers there are don't involve your income going up very much, then having a baby early can be perfectly sensible, right? So something that looks like, why are people doing this? It's just a deficit from a middle class perspective, really makes a deeper sense if you try and interpret, understand, appreciate the context in which it's happening.
Yeah.
So it seems like just appreciating the context can just generate a lot of novel insights, just like behavioral ecology does. Has policymaking considered this stance very seriously in terms of tackling issues of poverty and the decisions that might seem bad from afar?
So I don't think policy has really considered it. And to some extent, I try and use this perspective to talk about public policy issues. And to some extent, you have to take a sort of submarine strategy that you introduce these ideas, but you kind of don't show where they're coming from, because if you start saying, oh, people are having babies younger because of evolution, that just, any policymaker who hasn't left the room already is going to leave now, okay? Because it's like, that's just weird, right? What are you talking about? There's an evolutionary difference between, people of different social classes. That doesn't sound good at all, right? So if you do it wrong, you lose so many friends that it's worse than not doing it at all. But in a way, what you can do is keep the spirit, right? You can keep the spirit of the approach, which is saying, in context, a lot of the decisions people make are pretty sensible, and also some of the interventions you might come up with are not going to work because they're not really addressing the right contextual problems. You might think, we'll just, there are lots of examples of this. We'll put warning labels on foods saying, they're high in sugar and fat, but we won't change the cost of them, right? Or we'll have classes in school in which we tell, young women, don't have a baby when you're young, become a doctor instead, and that's like, it's not, I think, you laugh because you can see that's actually absurd, but this is the kind of stuff policymakers come up with. They really think that this is relevant, and they're just missing the point. Now, when I talk to those people, I don't tend to talk about evolution a lot because there's a sort of hazard in that people get distracted and they think, oh God, he's talking about something about genes, and it takes us down a wrong alley. But within academic circles, we talk like that. It's not that I don't believe the evolutionary stuff. I just think you have to be very careful about how you explain it. But the idea that context is important, I think that is something to keep hammering home. And just generally that the ecology is important. There's no point putting labels on the foods if people can't afford them.
Right. I really like the term submarine strategy. really describes it pretty well. Do you think, speaking of context again, it also seems like another literature, and we have had guests before on the podcast have talked about nudging and the context. It's just behavioral ecology in disguise.
No, I think it's the opposite. That's interesting. Really? Yeah. No, because the whole point about nudging, as I understand it, is that the problem is sticky psychology, and that that means that there are really cheap fixes, right? The reason people don't eat healthy is, their minds are just a bit lazy. So if you put like an app that popped up saying eat healthy today, that would do something, or these kind of very simple, cost-free, purely psychological interventions. And I think actually they don't generally work very well. At the margin, some of them might work, but I don't think they work particularly well. And I think that the reason is a deep one, which is most of the really problematic things people do are because of structural features of their ecology. And so just giving them an app that pops up or something without changing those structural features is not going to, it's not equal to the task, because actually minds are too they're too clever to just be, be sort of, really movable by kind of cheap nudges, I think.
Yeah, seen that way, it makes lots of sense. Like, if you redescribe the kind of nudge approaches, we have these biases that we can manipulate in some way. So you put the Snickers bars further back, and that'll work. It does sound like not.
Well, it's.
Sounds, yeah.
I mean, I think to give those guys some credit, for certain types of people in certain types of dilemmas, it might make a difference, right? So, for someone who's got enough money to buy whatever food they want, yeah, sure, put the Snickers bars at the back and the vegetables at the front, and at the margin it's going to change their behavior. But if you look at the population scale, right, there are millions of people in France or the UK who can't afford to buy vegetables. It doesn't matter if you put them at the front or the back, right? And so, I mean, the odd thing about nudging is the nudges work best with the people who need them most, in a way, right? Because by definition, to be nudgeable, you have to kind of be in the zone where you could easily do both things. But if in fact you can't afford the healthy option, then the nudging, is just going to leave you even further behind. And so I think that nudging, everyone was crazy about nudging about 20 years ago because, to politicians it looks like the Holy Grail. There's all these big intractable problems. Turns out it's just some psychological biases, and you just sort of give these people these little inputs. They don't really cost a lot. You don't have to do politically hard things like taxing people more. What's not to like about that? Yeah. But I don't think it's really addressed the underlying inequalities of our society at all.
But going back to like the submarine strategy thing, I think it's kind of ironic, you could say, that I think loads of the backlash that evolutionary approaches to human behavior get is people thinking that in a way it's justifying eugenics or justifying, or it comes with the idea that some people have deficits, and it kind of justifies that because it's evolutionary differences between people, when actually it's the other way around, and in a way it's a way of bringing back some rationalization into the picture.
I certainly think it is in the way I use it. The problem is that, in many people's minds, evolution equals genes, and genes equals like uncomfortable discussions about what the origins of differences between people are. And also a kind of sense of determinism. Well, if it's all of evolution, then we can't do anything about it. And now I don't think it is that. So what, for me, fundamentally, what does evolutionary biology teach us, right? It teaches us that the organism, like the individual organism, like any of us three, is the intersection of two things, right? It's an evolved capacity with an actually experienced environment, and that you can't understand any adult individual without both of these things, right? Because if you just have the environment, if you gave a chimpanzee my upbringing, you wouldn't get me, because it's different. It's got a different nature, right? It's not got the things I've got. It wouldn't be speaking English and so on. But on the other hand, if you grew me up in a tree, in Congo, I wouldn't be the same. So, but you've got to have both of these things. I mean, they're the warp and the weft of what. So, if by evolution you just mean that insight that, the organism has sort of non-random universal properties, but most crucially, those interact with the actual ecology as experiences, then we're all good. The trouble is, when you say evolution, people think, oh, you're denying that the whole ecology thing's important. You just think that the evolved nature is the only thing, which is absurd. I mean, that's so absurd that it doesn't even really pass first base, does it? I mean, it's...
So maybe since you're talking about context, it might be useful to circle back to our initial topic that we were talking about, which was inequality. And there's another trend that might seem like another bad decision made by people in uncertain ecologies, namely that people living in high inequality areas also experience high crime and low levels of trust. What does considering the role of context shed on this apparently bad decision?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. So, I mean, here again, you see that people are often as sort of they're keen to locate the sources of behavior within the individual and say so and so is just bad. Right? They're just a bad actor. And in fact, we know that the rate of acquisitive crimes, like robbing a shop and things like that, are pretty sensitive to the distribution of resources. So when unemployment takes an uptick, they tend to go up as well. When wages at the bottom of the distribution are squeezed, they tend to go up, and so on and so on. And more unequal societies where the gap, the people who are at the bottom of the income distribution are further behind, you tend to get more of those kinds of crimes. So if you think about people as solving the problem of they need to get a flow of resources for themselves. They have other goals too. They want to remain in good standing in their community. They want to keep their social relationships. They don't want to get punished. There's a lot of things they want to do,
right.
But they're sort of juggling these different goals. And it's just obvious that if you have more people who are in that economic desperation, I cannot meet my basic needs today, you're going to get more of these kinds of crimes. And that's actually a pretty well documented phenomenon. It doesn't explain everything, by the way. Crime takes all sorts of weird and slightly unpredictable. The rate of crime takes some weird and unpredictable turns. But roughly speaking, it does seem to be true. So rather than just saying, "Oh, there's some really bad people in society," it's worth thinking about, well, what are the actual dilemmas those people are facing on day to day, and if you give them better social protection, if you ensure that the distribution of resources is more equitable,
right.
might you actually really shift those kinds of things?
Right. So from a policy perspective, it seems like context is really important in terms of driving behaviors across diverse ecologies. What would be a good practical solution to sort of implement and maybe sort of ameliorate inequality and poverty?
Well, let me just say something about your point that context is really important. When you say this to policymakers, they roll their eyes because social science has been saying this for years, decades. Right? Context is important, but if all you mean is every different place that you do something is going to be a different outcome, in some completely unpredictable, ungeneralizable way, then it's hopeless for policymakers, right? So when social scientists say, "Oh, context is really important," you can see sort of economists and policymakers are holding their hands to say, well, what you're telling us is there is no general solution, right? The consequences of any particular change are going to be different in every street. And you can't tell me in advance which way they're going to go. So obviously when I say context is important, I think it's important in some systematic ways.
Right. It's not a ploy to get more money to do more field work.
No. It's not, and it's not just saying like every village is different, and you can't. Every village has to be understood in its own terms. And for 20 years I've studied number 51. And I'm not yet prepared to. All bets are off about number 52. It's because that's the sort of social science that rightly people kind of are a bit frustrated with. But so I've been working a lot recently on the idea of universal basic income, for example. So having a guaranteed minimum level of resources that every member of society gets, and they get as a right. I mean, it's very important that it's not something that can be taken away from them.
I see.
Just because they haven't done something or they've done something no one likes or whatever. It's really important that they know it's always there. It's there, and everyone knows it's always there. It's kind of inalienable, like the right to breathe the air. And I think a reasonable case could be made that a lot of socially problematic behaviours arise from either shortage of resources or uncertainty about resources. So actually thinking, well, what would a world look like where you knew that you'd never even temporarily fall below a certain level of material resources? To what extent would that reduce things like crime, but also psychological issues like anxiety and depression? And I think we don't know yet because it hasn't been implemented, but I think there are a number of lines of evidence, as well as a priori theorizing, that says, that really ought to make a lot of difference. So I think that's the sort of, when you start to think in these more ecological terms, you push yourself towards really fundamental reforms to the way resources are distributed amongst people, which of course reduces inequality, right? Rather than you need this policy for obesity and this policy for crime and this policy for depression and this sort of piecemeal treatments for things. If you say all of these problems are related to how resources are distributed and people's security in their resourcing, in their ability to live their lives, then what you end up saying is, well, we reform the ecology in a very fundamental way of giving everyone, an unconditional small flow of resources. Maybe a whole load of these different ills that worry us, all of them get better.
Right.
And of course, they're all related, right? People have psychopathology are more likely to also have addiction and more likely to commit crime, and there's a whole load of,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But is on the feasibility of universal basic income, do you think, like, what would the economist response to this be? Wouldn't they say something like, this you have to consider the ecology of giving out money to...
Yeah, well, you do, and you do have to consider that. You do have to consider, for example, whether it would be inflationary. But I mean, actually, we give out quite a lot of money already, right? And it's not. I mean, I work with economists on this, and there are as many answers to this question as there are economists. But it's not. It's not something that economists, rule out as ridiculous. Actually, what we have in society at the moment, the way kind of advanced states work, is they have a patchwork of really complex mechanisms for giving different bits of money to different people.
Right.
Right. In a way, this is just a proposal to simplify that. I mean, depending on how you set it, you don't even have to assume you'd spend any more in total, right? You just do it in a different way. And I think that partly that simplicity, administrative simplicity, is attractive. And partly, if you think that uncertainty is really a big part of the problem, then that orients you towards, say, well, doing it in this guaranteed way that everyone knows what they're getting and it's very simple to understand, is an attractiveness in its own right. Our current institutions have arisen piecemeal. You know how political processes work. There's one group of people managed to bargain for this over here, and some other group of people manages to bargain for that thing over there, and this other group of people, managed to bargain for that, and then, the government sees, there's this category of people who have this need, and so they introduce another thing, and so you actually end up with a whole panoply of different kind of transfer mechanisms. But one of the main things that the government does is transfer resources from some people to others, right?
Right.
So there's nothing revolutionary about this idea. It's just a slightly different way of doing it.
You mentioned other problems like mental health problems like depression. And this is a good segue to something else you've worked on, which is behavioral ecology approaches to things like depression. So how has it been traditionally defined, depression? And then what new perspectives can behavioral ecology bring?
Right. Well, I think that depression has been thought about in very different ways over the years, and still is by different groups of people. But in a way, we've become dominated by a very medical model of it. Now, I don't think that's entirely inappropriate, by the way. But it is a medical problem, but in a way, we've been very quick to say this is a problem of the brain, it's neurotransmitters, the way you correct these is with the pharmacology. And of course, there's a whole lot of people who have vested interests in saying that, right? Psychiatrists have services to sell, and pharmaceutical companies certainly have very lucrative medications to sell. So these are not neutral ideas about how to think about this. Now, I don't think those ideas are wrong exactly. I mean, there probably are differences in the brain between people who are diagnosed with depression and people who are not, though we don't know at this point what they are, by the way. You might imagine that we know that, but despite decades of trying, we don't. But even if something is a problem of medical concern, it can still have social determinants. Right. And so I think this behavioral ecology approach says, look at the social determinants, look at who is depressed. Guess what? It's people on low incomes. It's people who are socially isolated. It's people who have abusive or humiliating jobs. It's not it's not difficult to see that this is an expensive problem. Many people miss work. Many people require all kinds of social support and economic support because they're depressed. And at the population scale, if raising incomes or providing better community services or whatever can reduce that even by 5%, that's an incredible saving, right? Now you might say, well, those things are expensive. Well, sure, they are. They are expensive, but I'm saying not doing them is also expensive too, right? So in a way, I think that this is the conversation we've been having throughout. Thinking about this from a behavioral ecological perspective draws, rather than just saying something's just gone wrong in someone's brain, they've not got enough serotonin or whatever. It says, well, why might people feel hopeless, energyless, that they don't have energy to go about the things they want to do, gripped by anxiety? Why might people feel this way? Well, look at what's actually going on in their lives. Look at the social support they have, look at the resources they have or do not have. And so it draws our attention back to these broader social determinants. By the way, there are probably sociologists listening who'd say, well, yeah, we knew that. We don't need your, behavioral ecology stuff. We've been saying that for years. And it's like, well, I agree. We're on the same side fundamentally. And that's fine. If people coming from different points of view say the same thing in slightly different ways, then, that's all good with me.
Right. So if this idea that depression is really while being a medical condition, whatever that might be, is really a output of your sociological or socio-ecological settings, would one also predict that the prevalence rates of depression be lower in, let's say, more egalitarian societies like hunter-gatherers that are there around the world?
Yeah, well, I mean, so first let me say that it's very hard to know what the prevalence of depression is over time or between two places, because actually what counts as depression has changed so rapidly. I mean, it's even changed within Western countries in the last 20 or 30 years, right? There's been this diagnostic broadening. So many things that wouldn't... people think this is a kind of natural kind, but actually it's a continuum. And
could you quickly define what is a natural kind?
Well, what they think is, someone either is depressed and it isn't, and this is a fact, or they are not and it's a fact. But actually it isn't. It isn't really like that, because, someone could have exactly the same symptoms and they'll be diagnosed with major depression today, but in 2010 they wouldn't have been, and in 1980 they wouldn't have been, because what it is, the definition of depression. So this is not at all like, having malaria. But we know people have either got malaria parasites in their blood or they haven't. Being depressed is not like that. It's more like being tall, right? How tall? Compared to what, right? And it's sort of, at what point do you draw the line? So, of course, that makes it desperately difficult to say, is depression more common now than 30 years ago? Because even the way we measure it has changed. But then even more so if you want to go to a completely different society. I have mixed intuitions about, would depression be more common in hunter-gatherer societies than now. On the one hand, those societies are more egalitarian, and also people's social integration is probably on average better, right? People are very meshed in social networks. It's hard to be lonely. But on the other hand, they've got an awful lot to be depressed about, right? I mean, life expectancy is low, hunger is common, disease takes your loved ones. I mean, it's, material conditions are much more scarce. So I've actually got an open prior about which way we would expect it to go. And I don't know, you might know the answer to this question better than I do.
Well, we'll find out in a few years after some field work, probably.
But I think we shouldn't be... We should be very careful to avoid the sort of fallacy that says, well, hunter-gatherer societies are in some sense more natural, and therefore everyone is happy in them. I mean, that doesn't make sense at all. Of course, the kind of societies that we live in Europe are a kind of artificial construction, very untypical of our evolutionary history.
Right.
But in some ways, they're a better construction, right? There's more resources, there's
Right.
more, there's lots of things we can do now that we couldn't do
Yes.
because of that material abundance. So I've got a pretty open prior on whether people should be better off or worse off.
Yeah, within this socio-ecological approach, you proposed that depression could affect people via 3 pathways, and each of these has different implications for policy. Can you walk us through this?
Well, so basically in that study, we tried to look at how people's financial situation changes from month to month and how their depression symptoms are related to that. And yes, I mean, there's 3 things you could imagine. Firstly, you could imagine that when their financial situation gets worse, their depression will go up immediately. It's like a real-time readout. My prospects are worse, I feel worse. Or it could be they go up, but only sort of in a cumulative way. It's like, okay, I can, this month was bad, that's all right. But when it starts to be month after month after month, or your whole life, that starts to be really depressing. So you'd see this sort of effect, but it would be kind of like a build-up, a cumulative effect. Or it could be that, in fact, your change in your financial situation doesn't change your depression score, and the correlation between low income and depression is due to the other causal direction, which is people who are already depressed end up with low incomes because they have to withdraw from the labour market or they don't do so well in it. Probably all 3 of those things happen, but in the particular study we're discussing, where we looked at people's financial situations on a month-to-month basis, you do see this fluctuation that when people have a worse than normal month, their depression symptoms get worse, and their anxiety symptoms get worse as well. So they are, in some sense, reading out in real time the actual kind of ecological situation that they face.
Do you want to wrap up?
Yeah,
Or
we can wrap up at this point.
so yeah, like before ending every episode, we just ask each of our guests if there was something they would have liked to clarify or touch upon on what was said before.
I don't think so. I mean, something I could imagine that a listener might be thinking is, well, this sort of behavioral ecology approach sounds pretty nebulous, and it also sounds like the general claim that if it's just the general claim that kind of context matters and the structure of society matters, well, so we kind of knew that anyway, right? But what's the alternative hypothesis that context doesn't matter? I mean, that's sort of ridiculous, and that's probably right. But the devil of it is really in the detail of the specific models you make and the specific predictions you make, right? So always what we're doing in science is trying to have better ideas so we can pit against each other on the field of the data, and then the data will tell us, no, that's no good. You've got to refine that. So really we need to entertain very specific and multiple hypotheses about what might be driving things. So these very broad frameworks like behavioral ecology, they sound a bit nebulous when you sort of just present them at this level, but their value really comes when you actually try and do something much more concrete with them and say, in that case, I predict that this particular group of people, I make a model that says this particular group of people will experience this particular change when this particular thing happens to them. And then the explanatory value starts to be higher. And that's also where you start to see the differential explanatory value of, say, a behavioral ecological model versus a classical rational actor model versus some other more sociological idea. Sometimes these will say the same thing, and that's fine, but sometimes they'll actually make a different prediction, and that's where you start to sort of put them in competition with one another. And it's very hard to convey the sort of the value of that in the general case. One needs to really look at the individual studies and applications.
But I mean, maybe I would like to sneak in a quick question here. So we've been talking about, it seems to me that we have this impulse on localizing causes onto individuals rather than the environment, and fields like sociology, behavioral ecology, or some very general descriptive social sciences try to throw the ball back
Yes.
to the environment. Why do you think we constantly localize causes to individuals in such cases?
Because I think, that is a great question. I think that actually a lot of our life is about choosing which strangers to spend our time with. And the individual seems the relevant kind of unit. So, if I'm thinking about which of you two to become friends with, and one of you is always kind of turning up late or letting me down, and the other ones, I tend to go, well, I don't like that individual, I like that other one, right? So I'm sort of oriented towards the individual because in the domain of everyday life, individuals are pretty salient things, right? This one's got these traits and this one's got those traits, and I kind of prefer the one with those traits, or I get on better with the one with those traits. So,
But I'm sorry, there's no choosing between us. We come as a package.
but I think the point is that the individual is a very psychologically salient unit, and so you see someone who's whatever on the street, you think, oh. Why is that individual? Why is that individual on the street where this other one is not?
Right.
So it kind of becomes a very relevant explanatory frame for kind of most people in most daily stuff. But actually, if you want to know why are there 500,000 people on the street rather than 100,000 or none, it's not the individual level that's going to tell you that, right? It's things like government policies, the level of inequality, et cetera, right? The level of economic development. It's these structural things, but somehow the structural things are less kind of intuitive to people, and therefore it's somehow much easier to talk about individuals. And social sciences for decades have been saying, no, there's these structural things, and it's just very easy to sort of not think about those because the individual is such a psychologically salient level in everyday life. And I think that's the lure of the individual, the lure of attributing stuff to particular people rather than to their situations is a very strong one.
Oh, fantastic. One other question I'd like to ask is if our guests have a recommendation of some piece of media. It doesn't have to be like a textbook or a popular science book or something that like is about the studies or whatever, but it could be like any piece of media that illustrates what we said, like a film or a book or.
Well, we've touched on a quite broad range of topics, and I think I'd probably struggle to kind of give you one source that would cover all of this. From we talked about evolution right the way through to universal basic income. If you want the sort of evolutionary background done in a good way, there's a book by Nicola Rehani, R-A-I-H-A.
H-A-I-N-A.
Yes, H-A-I-N-A, that's right, R-A-I-H-A-I-N-A. So there's a lot of I's in her name. Called The Social Instinct, which is a sort of take on social evolution, bringing in many interesting examples from evolution and from animal ecology. But she doesn't go so much into the kind of policy implications for contemporary societies. And I think that's a kind of underdeveloped area, and in which we need to produce more stuff, communicating these ideas clearly and explaining that, talking about evolution in the context of people living in Paris or London is not weird. They are evolved creatures. There's nothing strange about that. So, and it might even make some sense of what they're doing. And it's not reductive, right? Calling you an evolved animal is not an insult. It's actually saying
the highest praise possible.
It's the highest praise possible. You have these incredible capacities.
True.
They're exquisitely designed by, the greatest sort of blind watchmaker there's ever been. It's not reducing you to say that you're, an animal. It's saying you're an extraordinary, structured, purposive creature with incredible abilities that relates to your evolutionary history and are very non-random, by the way. So, we need more work that kind of shows how talking like that about people in contemporary societies is not some kind of insult to them. It's not kind of demeaning them. He's actually saying their capacities are pretty amazing.
Do you think, again, I'm sneaking in another quick one here, but do you think there are some structural changes that need to be made in the way that people are taught about evolution to sort of do away with this impulse where people don't conceive of this idea as the highest possible praise, but rather as a very reductive?
Well, I mean, we're working against a kind of psychological barrier because in many cultures there's this idea that in people there is an animal part and a human part, an animal part and a sort of higher, more psychological part, and in a way it's it's always an insult to say, that's the animal part of that's the animal part of you speaking, right? It sort of reduces the higher goals you might have of beauty and rationality and compassion, and he said no, he was just following his animal instincts. It's kind of always a bit lowering, and I think that's just unfortunate. It's just unfortunate. I don't know how easy it is to overcome it, but people say, you beast. They say that, right? Then they don't mean it in a good way. You're a beast. They mean that you're sort of... Even actually, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a great champion of Darwinian evolution early on, said, in humans there's something else going on. All of the evolution stuff going on, but there's something else. There's the angel in them. And he said, he kind of had to have a special... He had all of evolution, and then he had a sort of special bit, which is the angelic part of humans. So we do seem to have a deep impulse to say that the bad parts of humans, their weakness, their hunger, their violence, their sleepiness, whatever, we're fine with that coming from animals. But their altruism, their aesthetics, their culture, we don't like. We think that comes from somewhere else. But then, of course, that raises the question: where else? Does it come sort of out of the sky? So in a way, we have to teach evolution to say, firstly, evolution is not genetic determinism. It doesn't mean that, all of your behaviors are kind of pre-programmed in your brain by your genes. But also it doesn't mean that you're kind of condemned to only ever express the least imaginative, most sort of visceral bits of you. All of the bits of us, including our capacities for imagination and culture, they come from evolution.
So
I guess that's the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been Cognitions episode 11 with Daniel Nettle. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much for the conversation. This episode marks the end of season 1 of Cognitions. We'll be back with more episodes and further updates after the summer break, sometime in late September or October.